Story 1. No one knew where you were all the time. Writing and receiving letters was incredibly special. People actually listened to music, read books, went to art galleries, spent time together, and played games. Privacy. No spam. Story 2. I think the internet was not as depressing as smartphones. The problem is staring at screens all day. Back when it was just televisions and desktop computers, you could step away from the screens. Story 3. Your self-worth and daily emotional spectrum were based around people you knew, not strangers who did not care about you or a company's addictive algorithm. It was not perfect, but it was better in that sense. Story 4. Not being flooded with sales and advertisements is like Woodstock compared to every music festival today. It feels organic because you are not sure quite what is out there. Now, it is all algorithmic money grabs where nothing surprises you anymore. Story 5. People did not cancel. If your friend called you and said you are meeting in 5 days at 2 p.m., you knew you would both show up. Story 6. Fewer people had severe dopamine addictions and therefore derived more enjoyment from their daily lives than people do now. My day feels bad if I cannot check the internet, but theirs did not, and I am very jealous of that. Story 7. Not knowing people's political ideologies or how religious they were. Actually, the early internet was great. Social media is the nightmare. Story 8. I found a quote the other day, but now I can't find it. It was from a previous Reddit post. It talked about how, before the internet, being the fastest runner in your town meant something. Now, after the internet, we are all so connected, and it doesn't mean much. You are constantly compared to the whole world, and that stuck with me. I'm an elder millennial and never thought about that perspective. How magical and unknown the world was before we had everything at our fingertips. How would you describe that? Are there any cool small-town stories that thrive then but wouldn't now? We had a burned-down house we called the Devil House, where a murder supposedly happened. It never did, but that was the local rumor at school. Now, that stuff is easily debunked, and I feel we've lost that mystique and magic. Story 9. Visiting with friends and family is enjoyable. Everyone is busy nowadays. We used to just sit at a neighbor's house. The children would play while the parents talked. It was nice. Story 10. I did not need to know the opinion of someone living in a shack 2,000 miles away from me, and they did not need to know mine. Story 11. I would make friends anywhere I went. At the movie theater, you joke with the people in front of you. At the mall, everyone was hanging out without phones. People were just connecting in person with one another. Still happens, but not like it used to. We were forced. Story 12. Believe it or not, news was gathered by well-educated professionals trained in reportage, accuracy, and a genuine desire to avoid bias. It was then edited by those who had passed spelling, grammar, and punctuation tests. The story was critically fact-checked by the smartest among us. Was it true? Were there at least 3 sources? If so, the news was published by those who cared about the country. It was not one-to-many information without scrutiny. It was one-to-many with careful consideration to get it right. What is different now is the onslaught of improperly reported news with a sensationalist race to capture the most attention. Doom scrolling of shameless low-quality content was not possible. Now, vast echo chambers of ignorance are endlessly repeated by those with less than critical thinking skills. Keystrokes were expensive then. Now, the Fourth Estate has hollowed itself out by giving those keystrokes away for free. We are left with empty newsrooms and newspapers that cannot cover city council or school board meetings. There was a bumper sticker. If the media didn't tell you, who would? That institution is gone, replaced by tens of thousands of social media opinions with no editing or fact-checking. Donate to the Associated Press. Subscribe to your local newspaper. Give to ProPublica. This editorial would have been read by at least 3 people smarter than me before hitting publish pre-internet. Story 13. Our brains were not being slowly fried by information overload. We did not make a hobby of getting upset over matters that were none of our business. We were not constantly being brainwashed by toxic propaganda. If you wanted to find a spouse, lover, or hookup, you had to put on your courage and actually go talk to people, and you were not shamed for doing so. Story 14. Kids could go to school, deal with whatever social issues they had, then come home to a safe place where they could decompress. There was no online bullying, no photos posted to humiliate, no groups created to specifically make someone's life a living hell 24 hours a day. If you had problems with someone at school, at least at 3:30 p.m. you could escape. Story 15. Reading an actual newspaper that was thrown at my door from the road and picked up by my dog, who delivered it to me for a cookie. Story 16. The lack of instant gratification was a big deal. It felt special to hear that phone call was for you. You felt like it was a special day when they played the song you had been wanting to hear on the radio or music video channel. Could be annoying, but it made the smaller moments much more meaningful. Story 17. There was privacy and freedom, and people were not constantly contactable or findable. Now, people expect instant responses. In the past, you left a message sometimes on an answering machine or with someone's mother. You might get a call back or you might not. Story 18. You went to Blockbuster and asked the person behind the counter which video game was awesome, and your sister asked the girl behind the counter which movie was a must-see. And it was always two 20-somethings, one guy and one girl. Mom or dad controlled what you watched on television during prime time. But the shows were just interesting enough that the whole family would watch. For the rest of the week, you'd talk about those shows with your parents as equals. You could say to someone, "I'm taping something," and they'd show courtesy about it. You had 1 week to watch it, 24 hours if it was sports. The Super Bowl was excluded. You rode the bus to school together, played in the neighborhood together, and often had the same classes. The closest friend I ever had was the only person my age on my street. Her mom refused to let her hang out with boys in high school after a pregnancy scare, but I was allowed to walk in the front door at almost any hour and even stay the night because we grew up playing in the street. You did something stupid? Just make sure Lauren didn't rat you out. Otherwise, it was a fun story for later in life. Bullies got beat up. Mean girls got karma. The bookworm could pay for college by tutoring the stoners and the jocks. But most importantly, music television played music videos. Story 19. The blank canvas. Creativity starts with a pause for inspiration, sometimes a long one, not a search for quick references. This is what I notice among millennials and younger generations. Everything begins with a mashup of this and a reference to that. They have no shame in borrowing a few ideas and calling it done. That is a new phenomenon. The result is a culture that always starts with a mood board made from previous work, always samples an existing texture or plugin. The artistic process is a refinement process which, in fairness, younger people have become very good at. Films, music, and design are produced at much higher standards now. But the decline in genuinely new ideas is palpable. No one actually sits with the blank canvas long enough to allow creativity. We have the least creative youth generation in history. Instead of an artistic revolution, we have dilution. Story 20. We survived boredom by doing unusual activities like going outside with our legs. Touching grass was mandatory. Story 21. Ignorance. Hear me out. Not having access to the entire world, meaning the information that you consume and have access to is smaller, was amazing. It allowed me to learn about the world as I got older. I had to search for information instead of having it constantly presented to me with every swipe on TikTok. Story 22. People were in touch with reality and were not completely insane. Can you imagine what would happen if the internet completely disappeared? People would absolutely lose their minds. Story 23. AM radio was mostly used for topics like gardening, history, science fiction, and conspiracy theories. You were driving at some ridiculous hour in the dark. Story 24. It is sad that people cannot just understand. Before the internet, life was normal. We did not know what we did not have. Life and the world were more genuine. The widespread commerce, greed, politics, and anger that engulf the public today simply did not exist back then. You have to have an open mind to grasp it if you did not live during that time. The lack of distractions made for a much different way of life. Story 25. We would be calling our friends right now, arranging to meet up someplace and bumping into another group of people doing the same thing, looking for something to do. Then we all found activities by trying them. not by searching the internet for entertainment closest to our location. With your friends, you learned what you liked and disliked doing, and the memories you make while discovering those things are much more enjoyable than today's routine of the same scenario. Bars were so much better. Being social and meeting people in general was much better before the internet. Story 26. You see, before, when somebody thought the world was flat or believed the entire scientific community was lying to them, everybody would say, "That's just dumb Cletus. He was dropped on his head as a child. He is pretty stupid." But now, Cletus can get online and meet up with Billy Bob, Cooter, and Jed, and they can connect with every other person who was dropped on their head as a child and start tweeting together. Before you know it, Donald Trump is the president. Story 27. You could go missing for long periods of time without guilt, and no one would be able to contact you or depend on you. Story 28. Actually, being happy to find something. Say you want to watch a movie. You need to go to Blockbuster or Video Easy, browse what is available, be disappointed when something is checked out, be frustrated, and be excited about trying to get it next time. Having limited choice was good for us. Generation Z just scrolls through every streaming service for 30 minutes and cannot pick anything. They have fear of missing out from so many options. Story 29. Conspiracy theories were just stories told around a campfire, not presented as truth on social media. Story 30. Going to the video store and picking out a movie just because of who is in it without knowing anything else, and then having the movie be amazing. The same applies to seeing an advertisement in the newspaper and deciding to see the movie without knowing anything else. Story 31. The chance on any given day to unexpectedly discover something awesome. Restaurants, movies, music, and new areas. Today, you find out everything before you take the journey. You live someone else's experience before you have the adventure yourself. Story 32. People engaged more either face-to-face or in actual phone conversations. People had better attention spans, and there were fewer socially inept individuals. Story 33. The local newspaper editors decided what was important in their readers' lives. Yes, we were blindly fed, but felt it was okay. Story 34. Reading an entire book instead of Reddit. I find I want instant stories instead of the deliciously peaceful immersion we once enjoyed. Story 35. This is more about social media than the internet as a whole, but I always say, before social media, there were people who would go to bars, sit with an angry expression, and if you were unlucky enough to sit near them, they would give you an earful about what they thought was wrong with the world, the country, kids today, this race or that race. Now, those people can broadcast those views almost all over the world. They can even specify the individuals they are talking to, nearly without limit. We have given a megaphone to the drunk person at the end of the bar whose reach used to be only those seated nearby. Story 36. I have been giving presentations at conferences for 25 years. Prior to the internet, people would pay attention to what you were saying, ask questions, and approach you afterwards to discuss ideas. Nowadays, they just sit in the audience on their phones, take a few pictures of the slides, and as soon as I am done, they leave and use their phones in the hallways. Story 37. I'm from a small town in Wisconsin with less than 1,000 people. When our sports teams played against other teams, it felt important, and there was a genuine cultural clash between the high schools. Each town had its own unique identity and culture in different ways. What was considered cool in each town was different. Now, everyone is influenced by the same things, resulting in fewer individual identities and a decreased importance of sports when teams compete. Story 38. People were kind to each other because the only way to communicate was in person or on the telephone. People played outside more often and behaved nicely. Story 39. Oh my God. Almost everything. People were smarter, for one thing. From a very young age all the way into adulthood, people had to understand directions, how to read a map for longer road trips, memorize everybody's phone numbers, and read a book to find out information they were wondering about. As a parent of kids who are not yet teenagers, I'm absolutely terrified. I was a good kid with a good head on my shoulders, but I did all the things, sneaking out, drinking underage, you name it. But nobody was filming anything or taking pictures of you. Nobody was watching every little thing you did. And you didn't feel the need to tell everybody every single thing you did as a source of validation. We didn't even know what teenagers were wearing, listening to, or doing in the small town next to us, never mind in another province or other countries. There was far less judgment and comparing yourself to others because of that. Teenagers still got into all kinds of trouble, and you hoped your kid was one of the smarter ones, but you didn't have to worry about online predators at every angle, online bullying, or all the negative effects of screen time and social media. You didn't have to worry that your kid was going to turn into a zombie, staring at their phone all day, having secret conversations over social media, or being bullied there. If your kid was talking on the phone with friends, they were doing it sitting at the kitchen table, talking on the phone that was attached to the wall. Kids of any generation will tell some lies, but everything was just much more transparent, and the world was just much smaller. Story 40. Finding things to do made doing things more fun. You didn't have the option to discard a task on a whim if it wasn't stimulating enough instantly. For example, you had to really think about a movie you wanted to watch, wait until you had free time to go to the video store, pick out a few titles, and plan to watch them. If a movie wasn't as good as you expected, you still watched it through and paid attention. This was often a group or family task, making the whole experience more meaningful. The real enjoyment was spending time with your friends and family. It was the same with other hobbies like gaming, listening to music, or learning a new skill such as playing an instrument or taking up painting. We had to put effort into something and really think about what and how we were going to achieve it. This made us more invested in these tasks, leading to greater enjoyment. Nowadays, we are too quick to swipe through and move on to the next mindless 30-second video for a quick dopamine hit. When there is too much novelty, nothing feels satisfying anymore. Story 41. That time was not magical. This time is completely overwhelming. Your brain is not supposed to receive information about everything happening in the world all the time. Story 42. I think the question is really about social media. The internet was glorious and greatly improved life, even MySpace. Then whatever Facebook did to life, that is what changed it. Story 43. People were more connected. You had to go in person to handle many things, which helped you use the social skills of interaction, such as waiting. I think people were a lot more patient. Story 44. You know how now when you post a question on Reddit and someone replies, use a search engine. You used to be able to ask a question and have an actual discussion for hours at a bar or gathering without any external reference material, which led to expanded discussions that were not so narrow. Story 45. You were not available at all times. People reached out and you responded when you could. That was normal. Also, you were genuinely surprised when you answered the landline and did not know who was calling. You exercised your mind constantly. You had to do things, create, and learn most of the time. You bought encyclopedias and used them for research in school. There are many other things I can think of. It was nice. Story 46. Not knowing things is part of the experience. Sure, it is neat to be able to look up everything, but I will never forget the excitement of having a friend tell me about some cool video game secret they read about in a Nintendo Power magazine. Story 47. Ignorance is bliss. What we did not know could not hurt us. Optimism was our reality. Our minds were not filled with never-ending nonsense. We sat bored for a little while. We actually had to exercise our imaginations. Story 48. I do not know that it was magical. In my opinion, it was safer, though. I am 67 and did not have a computer until I was 41. If it all went away, I believe I could adapt back to the old ways of doing things. Story 49. Being connected to nature without having to record your trip. When I was younger, there were many people outside going on camping trips, lake trips, and so on. Now it is rarely done. Story 50. Being unreachable was a luxury we all took for granted at the time, and it was more important than any of us knew. Now we are expected to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is not healthy. We should be able to go much of the day without being bothered. Story 51. For me, it was being able to be bored. To be honest, I am not sure if that has more to do with the internet or just getting older, but I look back on my younger years before the internet and recall having days where I felt like there was just nothing to do. The days felt like they went on far too long. It was either watching television, reading a book of which I did not have many, or going outside in the blazing South Texas heat. As I got older and had access to wheels, it felt like I met up with people a lot more. We made plans, figured out how to get to a place, often with printed maps, and made the effort to be there. When we all finally arrived, we were all there in the moment together. No faces planted in our screens, no distractions, just staring at each other, joking, and communicating in real life. Going to the mall, to bars, or out to eat, we were all just there, experiencing each other. Story 52. As a child and teenager, we actually spent time outdoors regularly. Staying inside was unpleasant. We went outside to play neighborhood sports, rode bicycles, skateboard, and explored. Story 53. Little things like surprise phone calls or pop-ins. Now it feels like you have to text someone to ask if you can call them. Story 54. You got bored, then restless, and started finding things to do, things to learn, hobbies to discover, and friends to reconnect with. Story 55. We had to find our own amusement. Staying home was not on anybody's mind. Everyone was happier. Fashion came from magazines, not from Instagram models and fake people. The internet makes everything complicated, and everyone has access to some form of your life. You don't need to talk to people if they saw it on Facebook. Looking amazing for social media and millions of people who do not care about you is more important than anything. Everything could be filmed and uploaded, making people hesitant to actually unwind. I do not know, just my observation as a 37-year-old who grew up through the transition. Story 56. Actually living in the moment. Going out without knowing who you would run into and having a great night. Experiencing monoculture. If you were bored, you created something to do instead of getting endless headaches staring at a blue light screen. Story 57. With video games, you had to figure out the whole game yourself. No guides, no spoilers. You could play a game for a year and still find something new you missed. It gave games more of a mystique. Now, everything is posted within a few days of a game's release. People today often talk about wanting a game to get lost in for hours, but the internet ruined that. I remember as a kid playing games like Pokemon Red and Final Fantasy VII, having to try every Pokemon to see who was good and exploring every part of the world in Final Fantasy VII to find hidden things. It made the game fun to find something hidden that most people didn't know about, but that's not common anymore. Story 58. A lot more simplistic. You were there in the moment. People actually paid attention to what you had to say instead of being on a phone. Imagination soared. You had to keep yourself entertained. Story 59. Not being able to know information. I would spend hours talking to friends about topics you can easily look up now. Story 60. It was quiet. You could disappear. You had hours or days when no one expected to hear from you. Not everyone believed their opinion mattered. Story 61. Answered your own question. Before the internet, you actually had to be there to experience anything. Just by being there made it special, rather than watching a poor quality video someone recorded on their phone or hearing a secondhand story. Part of the forgotten generation, but I have a great many memories I will never forget that do not come from the internet and being in many situations I was not comfortable with. Story 62. You actually put yourself together to go out of the house. Developmentally, it matured you faster because no one wants to be seen as a failure. There were social rules regarding rudeness and fewer people having rapid emotional swings in public. For me, I was more creative with my time, painting and creating collages on canvas with various media. Social skills are important, as is minding your own business and having discernment. Nothing compares to learning experientially in 3 dimensions. I also think everyone was in better physical shape because the world was not at your fingertips. You had to leave the house to be in it. Story 63. When the news was only an hour on television and said, "Here is a factual event that happened today. You decide how you feel about it, we are not going to tell you how to react." Story 64. Just being able to make a mistake, even if it was quite a bad one and only a few people would find out, would generally be forgotten soon after. Story 65. Healthy music industry, healthy movie industry, healthy newspaper industry, healthy book industry, healthier democracy. Story 66. I think people were more genuine. There was no social pressure to have a large number of followers or to constantly update your social media. Facebook was not so bad because people mainly used it for actual friends and family. However, if you wanted to play games with anyone, you had to actually get together in person. Story 67. The not knowing. If you were waiting for that new mystery movie, unless your friends were unpleasant, it was a lot easier to contain the surprise. Embarrassing moments were not captured in high definition to follow you around forever. Magazines were fun, quirky, and filled nearly every niche. It took skill to do research. You could easily disconnect from friends, family, and coworkers. You were not as tethered to your job. Bookstores were plentiful. You could collect concert tickets and movie stubs. Handwritten letters were a joy to receive. Not everyone was an expert on everything and anything. Story 68. People talked directly to each other. Every interaction was in person. If you wanted to do something, you called or just went to their house by bike or car, or went out to look for them at various hangouts. If you wanted a date, you spent time getting close through friends and situations, then mustered the courage to ask or had a friend help. Almost none of that happens anymore. Story 69. Not everyone was an expert on everything. People were not afraid to say they did not know. Also, the news was about an hour long and it was actual news, not commentators shouting at each other 24 hours a day. People seemed nicer. It was easier to make friends. There have always been wealthy people, but since the internet and influencers, children starting in preteen years know Louis Vuitton, Gucci, and other brands. Not saying everything was perfect, but it was pretty good growing up in the 1970s and 1980s. Story 70. If you wanted to be unpleasant, you had to do so in person instead of hiding behind a keyboard or using an alias. Phones were used to call or text, and you had a limited budget of around 300 messages a month, so you had to talk to people. Because of this, more time was spent in person or paying attention to people instead of being constantly distracted by games or social media. You did not have instant access to major world events. It was local newspapers and local news on television, so everyone did not have constant anxiety about the world ending. Story 71. Going to the reference section of the local library, researching any information took a bit of effort. Now I know insignificant information regarding people I have no business knowing about. We are collectively a little bit smarter, but a whole lot dumber. Story 72. Being smart was about knowing things correctly and recalling them from memory on demand without the internet. Story 73. Living in the present moment, being with people and actually together, not everyone on a phone, having time. Story 74. It is strange that before, when we spent time with people, we enjoyed it and chose it. Now, it is odd to see people together all on their phones. Why are you with people but choosing to focus on others on your phone? If there is one thing I would love to get back, it is just people without their phones. Whether it is family, friends, partner, or work, it becomes frustrating trying to connect and having to wait or stop because of whatever is going on with people's phones. Story 75. We were not so dependent on technology that we could not think for ourselves. There was more face-to-face, in-person human interaction. We used our imagination more. Story 76. People spend an average of 6 hours a day mindlessly scrolling, which consumes a lot of our free time. Without social media, there was more time to be outdoors, socializing, or relaxing. Story 77. Being connected. There were actual phone calls, letters, or people stopping by just to visit. Road trips were better too. Vacations were better, never being connected to work. People also did not think they knew everything about everything because we actually had to study and sift through books. Movies were not streamed. It was going to the movies or renting one. It was fun. Story 78. You had no way of knowing how unintelligent the majority of the population actually is. The ignorance was absolute bliss. Story 79. The pace of everything was slower, which made the whole world feel calmer. Also, without continuous access to endless entertainment, you were forced to come up with ideas to have fun. There was a higher level of satisfaction when you stumbled into what became a core memory that started with two people being bored. That is the stuff you sit with your friends and reminisce about decades later. Story 80. First, knowing the news generally had to be an intentional activity. The only conversations about it were with people around you, not arguing with random strangers on the internet or seeing their negative opinions. Second, every conversation with someone about their ordinary week was special because you had something to talk about. You had not already seen everything they were up to posted on social media. The upside of the internet is that people with niche interests were able to find each other and build communities around those interests, which may have been impossible for some people in smaller communities or towns. The downside is that white supremacists and neo-Nazis were also able to find each other. Story 81. I see it with my own parents and grandparents. They found ways to entertain themselves that usually involved the garden or tinkering in a shed. Story 82. Instead of using Google, we had to look up information in a series of books called the Encyclopedia Britannica. If that failed, we went to the library. Life had a bit more mystery to it, which was nice. Story 83. Misguided beliefs were not as easily spread. Not every person claiming vaccines cause 5G was able to share their views on social media. They had to do it the old-fashioned way by standing on the street corner looking foolish. Story 84. Depends on the time, I suppose. Everyone here is a different age and would remember pre-internet times differently. Generally speaking, I think people had more appetite and attention for learning. Did not know something? You would look it up in a book or ask someone who knew. If you were really curious, you got an education in a field of interest, and you valued that education because you would not find it elsewhere. People take education for granted with the internet. So much knowledge is at your fingertips, yet researching and educating yourself seems like a chore for most. I also think people, especially children, had more imagination. Story 85. Complete freedom. No one could track us, and people from different political parties hung out together and had fun because there was no conservative media trying to anger everyone and make us hate certain groups. Story 86. Doing genuine research and truly learning. It was so nice to look up information in a real book and know it was a fact. Story 87. Self-induced privacy. I do not know exactly how to explain that, but whatever we are doing now seems to be the opposite. Story 88. Knocking on a friend's door, and if they were not home, leaving a note to call you. They had your number written on the side of the refrigerator. Story 89. It was much less depressing. You could only get so much news at a time and could go hours without hearing how bad everyone is. Story 90. Actually, just talking to your friends when you are at a table eating, instead of everyone hunched over looking at their phones, is one of the saddest and most disconnected things ever. Story 91. There was a level of privacy. You could not be recorded unknowingly and shared on social media. Better laws are needed about this. Story 92. Minding our own business, enjoying the moment, not being constantly overwhelmed with negativity from 1,000 miles away, going and doing things with far fewer distractions. Story 93. There was nothing magical about it. It was very frustrating. Paper maps. We had to use paper maps to navigate. We had to talk to people on the phone. You had to pay people to do things you could have done yourself just because you could not look up how to do it. People who like to talk about it as if it was something grand, but I just remember being very bored all the time. Granted, I was about 10 years old. Story 94. Nothing. The early days of the internet were magical. We had never seen anything like it. The opportunities were endless. The late-stage internet is a cesspool. Story 95. Escape by going far away from people, up to 5 kilometers, 3.1 miles, where no one can find you. Story 96. Boredom pushed us to find and create activities. We spent time with friends, invented games, and read more books. Story 97. Pub conversations. You could have hours-long spirited, good-natured arguments with your friends over trivia. Now you just look up the answer in seconds, and the conversation is over. Story 98. It didn't feel magical then, but when I think back on it, it seems so much less unpleasant. We took it for granted that people had friends they would see in real life without phones in their hands looking for something more interesting all the time. Being bored together, just talking, making up silly things to do, or driving around and listening to music. I miss that. Now it feels like everyone constantly wants to be doing something else. They are literally texting someone else while they are right next to you. Everyone's attention is constantly somewhere else. The things that mattered were happening locally in your family, your friend group, or your community. Now national politics dominate everything. Local newspapers are all but dead. Things happening far away seem more important than what's happening down the street. No one knows their neighbors. We are more divided and alienated from each other now. You used to have to talk to people and be decent and polite to them. Story 99. The ability to wonder, have conversations about possibilities, and debate what things could be. Now everything is just a search engine away. Story 100. Kids went outside to play. People did not feel entitled to say incredibly rude things to others they did not know. But you could not do any banking when banks were closed, and unless you had encyclopedias at home, you had to go to a library to look things up. Getting anything published was incredibly difficult. It was a closed, highly selective system. Now you can give, and publish information and disinformation 24/7. Story 101. Learning something new like gossip, facts, or a new hobby feels different. Now it feels kind of blasé because something new is always right around the corner. Story 102. People were real. You either walked the walk and talked the talk or you did not. There was no hiding behind a keyboard, and Photoshop or filters were not something most people had access to. Story 103. Going out to a meeting place or the pub without any prior arrangement, hoping your friends might be there. Coincidentally bumping into people you know or friends from home while traveling, without checking in on social media. Story 104. Playing PlayStation 1 and calling on old phones, hanging on, ringing doorbells, then running away, playing sports on the streets, etc. Story 105. Getting snail mail was really nice. It felt special to receive a letter from someone because people do not send letters very often anymore. Story 106. I was born in the late 1990s. The internet growing up was a form of magic that I could not use when my mom was on the phone. Since I do not have social media like Facebook, I believe I am much less bitter about it. Personally, I love the internet. It has enabled me to identify and embrace my creativity, knowledge about cars and hobbies, and interests. Story 107. It used to be a lot easier to tolerate people when you could simply view them as ignorant rather than willfully ignorant. Story 108. Nothing. People are the same now as then. Being bored was exactly the same. You would sit and switch channels on the television, flip through radio stations, read the television guide. Now we answer questions on Reddit. Story 109. Pleasures were undiluted by the dopamine hits social media scrolling gives. People in basic training must experience severe withdrawal symptoms. It was intense enough before mobile phones and the internet. Story 110. Not knowing. Having a bar disagreement now, parties pull out their phones and get an answer. Before, both would be vehement in their positions but would walk away without something definitive. We were okay with it. Story 111. Not having to know everything in the world and focusing on yourself and the things around you. Now, you see the genocide in Gaza daily, and recently Israel attacked Iran, and it is everywhere. In the past, wars seemed much more distant. Story 112. I would say the ability to simply be. No negative opinions from other people, not that it did not happen. To be able to enjoy life more fully. Story 113. Blockbuster. Everything about it. Walking into a sea of possibilities. Building your whole night around it. A single choice there could determine the course of the rest of your life and the lives of anyone with you. Story 114. You actually had to call and deal with people directly. It gave you a better sense of people's skills. You looked around at the world instead of at your phone. There is magic and beauty in nature and the little things all over the world, and some people were inspired to see more by traveling. You had to memorize things like phone numbers and roads, which helped with spatial recognition and memory. You had to go somewhere more often than not to be entertained, meaning you had to use those skills practically. Sometimes you would get there to find out it was closed or too busy, so you would find something else nearby, maybe something new. The internet has a lot of advantages, but there is still something to be said about the world before it. Story 115. I feel like the internet was a big change, but nothing compared to smartphones. That is where the major shift occurred. Story 116. Nothing, people just have hardcore misplaced nostalgia. It is much better living in a world with the world's collective knowledge accessible by a rectangle in my pocket just a few button taps away. Me as a kid would think adult me's ability to order a pizza on my wristwatch was literally magic. Story 117. You know that awesome feeling when everyone is having a laugh and all of your friends are just chilling? Yeah, that moment lasts for days. Story 118. I love to go camping where there is no internet or cellular reception. I tell the biggest lies about current events. No one can confirm or deny. Magic is back. Story 119. I love to go camping where there is no internet or cellular phone reception. I tell the biggest lies about current events. No one can confirm or deny. Magic is back. Story 120. Hearing songs for the first time on the radio or having some of my favorite artists premiere their new music videos on music television. Not being overly advertised to. I used to run to Kmart's toy section to see if anything new had arrived. Good times. Story 121. The magical time was the late 1990s of the internet. It was new and had not taken over yet. It was in addition to all the activities we were doing. Story 122. Bar arguments that would end with someone grabbing a book, and if you were lucky, it had the answer. Story 123. Nothing. It was just a different version of things you have to wade through to find peace. And I see you out there. You will. Story 124. People actually interacted and had social skills. Everything was not instantly available like online dating and food delivery services. If you wanted Swiss chocolate, you had to go to Switzerland. If you wanted a movie, you went and rented one on Friday night. You rode bikes, played outside, and played with toys. Now everything is social media and instant communication. People could not get a hold of you and did not know where you were if you were not home to answer the phone. We had block parties and potlucks. Much of the community we used to have is gone. It was a vastly better time. Story 125. Connection and accountability. If you called one of your friends a spineless person, there was no anonymity and you owned that. Then again, you usually beat the hell out of each other, went to swim club, and were still great friends. Story 126. The real need for the written word. To understand something, you needed textbooks, encyclopedias, and dictionaries. Life was full of learning at a snail's pace. Story 127. Kids today. Story 128. There was boredom and a constant contest of wit that happened spontaneously. The winners of the competitions, if considered reasonably attractive, could have intimate encounters. Story 129. Having to create entertainment. I remember life before television cable. It was better in the respect that ignorance is bliss. Story 130. Meeting up with friends required planning and coordination. Seeing friends took more effort but also felt more rewarding. Story 131. You know how when you leave work or school for the day, and it is just done until the next day? Absolutely out of your mind. No worries. The entire day was like that for everything. Story 132. It was not magical for everyone. I grew up in the 1980s in a small town where I did not fit in and felt very lonely and isolated. There were no people like me and no way to connect with people from outside my town. My childhood would have been much better if the internet had existed and I could have interacted with the rest of the world. I would not have felt so alone. Story 133. No record of anything anywhere. These days, you can be sure you will be recorded by a video camera from 5 different directions every time you leave your house. There is no privacy to be had. Story 134. Young people have no idea what it is like to not be on stage for every person in their life simultaneously. You could be in your 20s, 30s, or 40s and have spheres of your life that were entirely separate. That meant you could be more free because there was not this cultural obsession with integrating random aspects of your identity into this gigantic rubber band ball of who I am. Sure, that meant you might have to go to work and have everyone assume you were straight, but it also meant you could go out and express your sexuality for one night of your life and not have to integrate it into your personality. Personal branding was considered Orwellian. Now it is just normal. You were not comparing yourself to everyone, so when something felt magical, you could develop your version of it until it really was unique instead of joining some online community that would sap all the magic, fun, and personality from it. Story 135. Before the internet, there was real touch on everything. People, objectives, narratives, all connected to a certain level. After the internet, it was request and response. I want, I wait, I forget, all come and go and are very shallow. Story 136. Arguing about what happened in a movie, who played a character, where a place is, or how long it takes to get there can be common. As someone who grew up in the 1980s, I often forget that all these answers are available on my phone. However, we all sometimes forget that the answer is there. Now, you can get an artificial intelligence answer on who is the most powerful X-Men character. In my day, this was a topic of conversation. That is lost now. Story 137. The only subscriptions were magazines or the infamous Columbian records. Some book services too. More than everything else mentioned here, you had nicer things, just fewer things. Story 138. We did not ask this question. We just went to the place where we would meet up or called friends and asked specifically if they were home. Music was CDs, tapes, and if someone had a record player, we would use that. Late nights for stoners, we would take the bus to buy candy and wait until the connection had some weed we could afford. If not, we would still play games, listen to music, call friends, and see who could make it out to chill. Story 139. Even right now, the world is more peaceful than it has been. But everyone is paranoid and going crazy about everything that happens. Before the internet, we did not go crazy because we just did not have access to most atrocities around the world. So we just lived in a bubble, basically limited to our neighborhood. Story 140. Nothing. If you want to go back, you can simply choose not to use the internet. You will hardly notice any difference, other than occasionally seeing people on their phones. Story 141. I got very involved in music, learning, writing, playing. As the song says, must have played in 1,000 bands. I had a few other hobbies as well. My cars were always clean. Story 142. There was more content than advertising. People saw advertising as an interruption only necessary to pay for the entertainment. I watched the same advertisement 10 times in 30 minutes. Story 143. We were more connected and looked forward to seeing each other, talking at dinner. There was less influence from outside sources, and marriages lasted longer. Story 144. It is difficult to explain because it is not easily quantifiable. The difference was an experience that I have not seen anyone describe. You were more intimate with your immediate environment and with life. Everyone trying to answer this question by referencing features of the old world that do not exist in the new world is approaching it incorrectly. The difference was a shared experience that made life more vibrant. Story 145. If the internet had been around when I was young, I really cannot imagine how smart I would be. I have spent the last few decades discovering. I think that the internet is magical. Even my 90-year-old mother said before she died in 2020, just ask that internet. Story 146. Cults were harder to convince people to join since you had to use word of mouth instead of artificial intelligence and robots. Story 147. When I was happy, I was present. I was aware of my happiness. Now, when I am present, I am deeply aware of all the chemicals that have been burned up on various internet browsing sites, and I am depressed. Story 148. Not knowing things and not easily being able to verify required relying on and trusting the experts. Story 149. Life was universally better. The internet has led to many great things, but it has made us all less intelligent and less motivated. I personally believe we would have been better off without it. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.